Welcome back to Cut Daisies and Unicorns. This is another Phil and Steve edition. And it's always a good day then when it's a Phil and Steve edition. And I'm not to say that I don't love our guests. I love when guests are in interviews and learning about people. But it's also good just to sit around the table with Steve.
Aww. Phil, you know what I was thinking the other day about you?
Yeah.
I really appreciate that you're not stupid.
Oh.
I mean, like in the positive light, actually, through my mind, the thought was, I really appreciate your intellect. Oh. And I appreciate, we were helping out Laura in a Chicago public school. They actually let both of us in at the same time.
Right.
We passed all the CDC questionnaires, and the security guard let us in. Both of us were at temp, green beep, and that was super cool.
It was.
But as we were working through the soundboard difficulties and stuff, what crossed my mind is that you have gained a lot of experience in being left by yourself as a pastor. Like things that were spoken to you that you would need to learn, you actually learned.
Right.
And I find like there's times when I hear you talk and I know that you've studied and, you know, different things like that. And I would consider a well-rounded human being. Not only do you like to couch potato and veg out watching video and movie, but you all are also a fan of the analog book. Yeah. And so anyway, it was your intellect. And so Amy and I were having a conversation last night. I'm like, you know, when I become irritated with humanity, it has to do with humanity's stupidity.
Right.
Which is actually a sign of my own arrogance and pride. Right? I mean, because I would think that, and we were just discussing how in our lives, if she and I had met earlier, we never would have been attracted to each other. But because as we've aged in our seasoning, then it's one of those things that we have great admiration for one another. And she has this, I don't know, preconceived idea of how she sees me, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
That how we see ourselves versus how others see us is an interesting perspective shift.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting understanding when you're starting to say, how do other people see me? And how does that then reflect? How does that reflect then how they're going to interact with me then too? Yeah. So I mean, all of that stuff that I learned, I mean, is all from you, anyways. Like you were the only one who was teaching me soundboard issues, and you know, and how many times, you know, when you were in Iowa, I was like, I gotta call Steve because there's something wrong with this. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And so all of that is just a process of learning from me. And just as you learned, you know, through that, and then you're like, hey, I got stuff to teach. So you did the same thing yesterday with Laura.
I did.
You're like, hey, this is what you need to know. Like, you don't have to even worry about all of this. Here's like 1, 2, 3. And that's the way that I started learning from you as well, was like, yeah, don't worry about this, just worry about this. This is good, this is good. And then if you get in more depth, we'll handle that later.
Yeah. And for those of you who are out there and wondering about, and, you know, I have a very pragmatic approach to a lot of things. If you have 7 people on a stage and performing, the goal isn't to see how difficult or how many things can be introduced. The goal is to break it down and be like, how can you get 7 people doing the simplest things together? And then based on that, then you can have success together. Once you get to the point of success of playing together, then you can move on to the more difficult things. And so, with Laura, what we did, soundboard technology, we just broke it down to, hey, you don't need 24 channels. You only need 3. And then here are the gain structures. We eliminate 1. We get everything else set. I love the sparkle in her eye when we had everything shut off and when we turned on the first mic the first time and it sounded awesome. And she's like, this hasn't sounded this good ever before. And literally, folks, it was a complete board reset. Everything was back to baseline, and there was nothing special about anything going on.
Right.
But you do have to understand that if you're working with sound, you are going to reproduce what is being captured. And, you know, it was with an assumption that all the parts and the pieces that were interconnected were all working fine. And until we proved that wrong, I was willing to go forward with it. So I'm a master of elimination, and we just took all the parts away. And I actually made an executive decision, CPS. You don't realize this, but I eliminated 2 pieces that should have never been there because stuff didn't even work through it. So we just took it out, and she allowed for disposal of it through the proper channels. And it was a good thing. And so, but I think it was in that, like, as you were talking to her and the things that you knew and stuff like that. And I know that, like, on Sundays and stuff, when I'm working with Andre and different things, you'll step over to the board and you'll be like, oh, I can be able to help out here because I'm, you know, back of house at the time and stuff like that. And I was like, but what I really appreciate is you're not an idiot.
Well, yeah, I'm certainly glad to hear it, though. Because sometimes you never know.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're like, I feel like an idiot sometimes.
And there's the part. I think a major part of navigating life is if you assume that you are the idiot, you get a lot further. Yeah. You don't. Who likes the person who walks in the room who postures as being the expert of all?
Oh, yeah.
Disdain.
Right.
I have great disdain for people like that.
Right.
And so I want to be unassuming in all roles. And I think that stems from a core value of mine, which is seek to understand before being understood. I think in the tenor and tone of our podcast, people will find that really that's the goal of the podcast is we're searching for stories. Right. We're seeking to understand. We're not coming to the table with some preconceived idea of what things should be, but we are wanting to learn from others. And that's how you gain knowledge, and knowledge put into action, I think turns into wisdom.
Yeah. And I think to me, it also just gains perspective, right? I mean, you catch a different perspective when you're open to understanding where somebody else is coming from.
But
We've
again,
talked about that. But
yeah. But again, like what we were talking about, what does it mean how others are perceiving me? It's a different perspective. The facets of how we look at life, they're even in a cut diamond, how a diamond reflects light is based on the amount of facets that are cut.
Yeah.
So there's a different cut angle to be able to look through.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's why in community, it's really good to have conversations where people are able to walk in and say, hey, I've noticed this. Or you can come to the table and say, you know what, I'm finding this in me. Do you find this in me? You know, and those questions. And then based on the different perspectives, then the whole is able to be revealed. In the vehicle that I currently drive, there's a lot of blind spots. And I've learned in driving in Chicago that I have to adjust. I can't have a casual drive. I have to adjust how I'm looking through my rear view mirror and my side view mirrors to make sure that I'm not coming into a lane or something that where there literally could be a car in my blind spot.
Yeah.
And for any person who's listening, there's probably a lot of people who are not listening that will never hear this truth.
Okay.
But the reality of blind spots is a part of our own existence that we need to be able to embrace.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of saying, well, I don't have blind spots.
Right.
I mean, like, if you're saying you don't have blind spots, I'm guaranteeing the blind spots are really, really big.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably people in your life currently begging for the opportunity to make you aware of the spots that you're not seeing.
For sure. Yeah, and I think that when you look at the whole perspective on this, and where you learn the most about yourself is usually from other people. I mean, because I'm going to be the worst one to be able to fix me. Like, so if I'm left to my own, I'm going to continue with what I think, what I know,
Sure.
how I operate.
Yeah.
And going down that path, then you're saying I'm going to deny any blind spots. I'm going to deny that there's anything that's wrong with my perspective. And if we live life that way, we're going to miss out on a whole bunch.
Yeah. And I think that if people, isn't it interesting in the aging process, how that as we go through childhood, grow through adolescence, into adulthood, but then as we age, what has been talked about? Now, I'm not familiar with it with any great experience, but then you enter into a second childhood.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wonder how this childlike approach to discovery.
Yeah.
And I would take people back, and if you wanted a question, because we'll probably have more in this episode.
Oh, yeah.
More questions. But if you would take a question and say, what is the last childlike memory of discovery that you had? I think that would be a good thing to sit and ponder.
So give me an example.
So as I'm speaking that question, I'm thinking about the very first thing that popped into my mind was at my home of origin, where I grew up. It's not the place where I was born, but where I grew up. It was a little farm in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first time I get to say this on our podcast. Located in Huron County at the town of Bad Axe, Michigan. And
Bad Axe.
I know. It's like part of my history that I am far enough removed from that it doesn't come up very often.
Right.
But yeah, I played for the Nasty Hatchets in football.
Wow. What a name.
Yeah. Just around the corner from Elkton, which was named because of the elk herd, and that when people were settling that area, it was a major place for them to be able to get food.
Huh.
Bad Axe was a stump at a crossroads that when people had their wagons and things like that, they would say, go to the Bad Axe and take a left and go north to be able to get to Lake Huron.
Huh.
So then Bad Axe became the settlement place. And really for a town of, at the time when I was growing up there, I don't know what the population is now, but for the time, a town of 2,000 had a lot of vibrant retail. Well, the reason why is because it was a pass-through town to get to the lake.
Wow.
So all the beachfront and all of that stuff that was going on, it was the place where, like, if you had a beach house, you could get groceries at the corner grocery store, but if you wanted to stock up for the week, you would come to Bad Axe. It was a 15, 17-minute trip, on Highway 53. And so I grew up, but where my mind went to is we had a 120-acre farm. 60 of it was farm lot that my dad and mom rented out to the farmer. That paid the mortgage on the house. And my dad had received that farm in the inheritance of the passing of his own father. And then my mom and dad moved out from my grandfather's farm, a portion of the house that I grew up in. And so I literally remember us going out and my dad with a push mower mowing down the grass to make the way and pave out the place where the foundation would be dug. And the house got moved from Owendale to where we lived and set on the foundation. And then they built an extension out, an addition. And so we had a 3-bedroom home with a full basement. And but when I think of fond memories as a child in Discovery, it's me as a 9, 10-year-old just walking through the woods. There was a creek that went through that.
Yeah.
The wooded lot was white cedar and red cedar and birch and maple, ironwood, and how times have changed. Because the idea of letting a 10-year-old leave and just be gone for the next 6 hours. Then we actually had a bell on the back of the house, and when dinner was ready, my mom would ring the bell, and I could hear it from anywhere on the farm. And she knew that I'd be back in about 10 minutes or whatever, and I'd traipse my way back through and stuff like that. Yeah. So like in Discovery, just the idea of, and actually this takes us into thematically, I just caught up with the simple things in life are so beautiful. And that point of discovery was in the beauty of what was around me and just being able to, it could be raining out. It didn't matter. I was under all this treescape, it could be raining, but there were droplets coming through the trees or whatever, but it's not like I was being
mostly cover.
Yeah. Showered on and all that stuff. And yeah, so that's what it takes me to. How about you?
Yeah, so that's why I was just thinking the discovery part. I don't know if this will get us off topic or not, but I remember, and this has happened through years of, discovery for like current looking back. But I remember as a younger child being emotional.
Oh,
and so this is like something that is important. To our conversation that we were having, the topic we were going to get into.
Yeah.
But being emotional about things, like I was always worried about my mom, and I'd get emotional, or something, and I don't fault anybody. I don't fault my parents for it, but what they would always like, don't do that.
Oh, yeah.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of that what happens over time, when I look back in discovery of who I am now.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of it, like if I'm feeling emotional, then I'd say, don't feel that.
Oh, wow.
So thinking back on that, and it's a hard concept to try to be able to process, like, so how do you now,
Yeah.
like, I'm 42 now, looking back even, 30 years ago, whatever.
Yeah.
Like over that period of time, and I didn't learn about this stuff about what it meant to not be encouraged to feel, and so it was always like, all right, so what does that mean now? And so what did my wife do? Like, so how are you feeling? Like, my regular fine.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, you don't look fine or you don't seem fine.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, I don't know how much of it is just subconscious, like this is what you have to be is fine.
Yeah.
And to me, I think that was a self-discovery, not then, but now looking back, like, I mean, I feel like there was emotion, and then all of a sudden there's like, I get to be, I mean, a lot of people then that knew me 20s, 30s, like, I don't know if you have emotion. Like, you don't seem like you're passionate about the things other than what the things you're passionate, like, like
Sure.
kind of go, well, I don't know. I mean, a lot of that is still, it's still a process for me to be able to say, how do I process emotion?
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know. So that's what I think about first when you said childhood discovery, but I think that's more of looking back at my childhood and understand. I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think that this will all play into this episode, and what I find very interesting is, probably the hurdle that I trip over the most is when somebody says, "Hey, go have fun." Or they ask the question, "Hey, did you have fun doing that?" And as a firstborn child who grew up in the late 60s through the 70s on a farm in Michigan, who was the grandson of an incredible farm holder, I don't know that I consider things fun.
right. But what does that mean? Because even sometimes people would say, when you're doing this project, you're like, well, was that a fun time? Like, I mean, almost sarcastically, or, and that's a language I speak more, sarcasm, than, I mean, because that almost is, to me, I think of sarcasm as kind of repressed emotion. I'm like, oh no.
We're all in good company here, because our producer John is his love language is sarcasm, and so yeah, and so we can even go down that line of sarcasm, cynicism, nihilism, and then we come back to being, and yet, what does here's a quote from a gentleman that I actually haven't thought about in a while, but am glad. I think of him fondly. Bill Jesse.
Oh, yeah.
And Bill Jesse was the HR director at Glory Day Lutheran Church, where I was an employee for about a decade. And he would have meetings with all the employees, through the month and stuff like that. And he always teased. He's like, I usually book this time for a half hour, but then there's a COBOL half hour. I'm like, what's a COBOL half hour? He's like, well, if we're working on COBOL time, he's like, that's somewhere between 47 and 55 minutes. He goes, otherwise I would book it as a COBOL hour, which would be an hour and 15 to an hour and 20. And I'd be like, oh, nice. So, but, Bill, retired school teacher, school administrator, lovely gentleman, human being, big heart. And, but he would always say, hey, what are you doing to feed your soul? Now, there's language that I can be able to identify with. And there was a time when my profession was being a pastor, and so what fed my soul was playing guitar. But then in becoming a worship director, then playing guitar became my profession.
Right.
And so then playing guitar wasn't feeding my soul. And he sent me down this path of, hey, what's feeding your soul? And there's many sources. And again, a great question that we could put on the page and say to the listener this would be a great pondering for you right now.
Mm-hmm.
What feeds your soul? What is the thing that, even though in responsibility and whatever you're pursuing, whether it's being a parent, whether it is pursuing profession, whether it is something that takes up a lot of your time in your day, but what's feeding your soul? Now, right wingers will be like, well, God feeds my soul. Reading scripture feeds my soul.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's appropriate because we understand that in our audience that there are people who are people of faith. We recognize that the other thing that we're doing on this podcast is we're putting out there for people of all faiths to consider this journey of humanity. And so I would just bring back to the person who would ascribe to a Christian faith and say, that's good. It's a good thing that the reading of Scripture and a time of reflection and prayer, that feeds your soul. And then I would ask the question to you in a different way. And does it? Or is it a checkbox? Is it something that you're doing because you're told that you should do?
Yeah.
Or is what you're practicing flowing out from something that is authentically feeding your soul? And then we move into nihilism and the Song of Solomon, and that there's nothing new under the sun, and all is vanity. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, this is where I land in that whole thing about, is this fun? Mm-hmm. Because what I found is things that feed my ego are things that I enjoy. Mm. So performing in front of large groups, doesn't matter what the content is. What do I enjoy about it? I enjoy the performance. These are things that I have learned on the road of my own personal growth.
Yeah.
Now, you can talk probably, here's where community plays, and I have no idea what Phil's going to say about this, which often enters us into a really interesting conversation.
Right.
You see your eyes are bright and you're smiling, and it's great.
Like, where are we going to go?
Yeah,
where are we going?
Yeah. Let's make it weird. So, but I can see it in him. But I would just ask you, I think I know where this will go, but I don't know for sure where you'll land on this. I've seen, as I've entered, I would consider the last third of my life, that in having identified that performance feeds my ego, mm-hmm. I've moved into a place where it doesn't matter as much to me. Mm. And so I would just say, do you see a shift in me from when you knew me 10 years ago?
Yeah. I mean, I always see even a shift even since you've been here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
this
a real
is a
shift.
completely new season for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was a lot, taking a look at you in the past, like even when I first met you. And, there was like, when I first met Steve, because we got hired at Gloria Day around the same time. I was like a couple of months before you came on.
Yeah.
And it was like, I'm like, I like Steve. I mean, I remember even talking to Ron, like, and I even brought up, like, why are we trying to search for somebody?
Oh yeah, because in that first 6 months,
they were like,
we're going to do a national search for an LCMS, kind of person, and I was
system person.
Yeah, everything not LCMS. Yeah.
And so that's why I was like, I mean, I had brought that up a couple of times with them, which is where they ended up landing, which was happy about. But there's so much I didn't know about your story and about where you came from and all of that. But I think that over time, what I saw is like there were, there were peaks in your life, there were valleys in your life, and
Yep.
going through both of those,
Yeah.
seeing how is it that we're going to react here, and and
Yeah.
some of that, even the tough stuff,
Mhm.
like you weren't worried about talking about it. Like I would have had a much more, I would have a hard time
Yeah.
trying to process that. But you weren't afraid to be able to like, this is what it is. I mean,
Yeah.
going through difficult things.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's like that's something I learned from you.
Mm.
As much as I learned about sound and, which nozzles to
The nozzles.
which knobs, which things to turn, what not to touch, what to do, what not to do. I mean,
Yeah.
so I learned that stuff from you, but there's a lot about your, just even over time and even current, like how you handle things around you, how you handle, people and relationship and emotion. And, like there's so much that I know that changes me because of what I know from you.
Yeah.
And so I see that shift, and I just see this, that part that you're, and you saying like you found being in front, like, hey, performing, that there was something about that connect. But right now, you're like, I don't want to be there right now.
Yeah.
And like, okay, like this is a shift.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I love it right now because I do love to see you perform.
And that's fair.
Right.
And I understand that to be true. And it just is so crazy on Rohr talks about the shadow self.
Mm-hmm.
And yet where I think the point where I'm living right now is just really being okay in the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
The processing, and maybe this is another therapy session in regards to it has to do with processing through a decade of the veneer and doing the work into the core. And so I don't know where it lands. I don't know what ends up. I just know that ultimately when, again, my perspective is I'm not saying, okay, I have my ball and I'm going to take my ball and glove and go home and like, we just can't play this game. It's not that. I'm more than willing that in a place of need to be able to fulfill and to do whatever's necessary. And for those of you who are out there who question even what, a spiritual journey is for you, or you're like, I don't believe in God. Hey, keep listening, work through this, because we're heading actually to the real episode shortly.
Well, it's things you don't know yet. I mean, that's the whole, what we're trying to do with this whole thing is like reveal things that you either haven't thought about, things that you...
Yeah. And so where I would go with that is just to say that I believe that there is a world that is unseen. And in that world that is unseen, people of the Christian faith would call it the kingdom. Mm-hmm. I believe not only is my physical body here, and my physical body is living out life as my physical body knows, but I also have something that is within me that is living out a life in the unseen. Mm-hmm. It's the very same thing that when I listen to a meta story or a meta conversation in my mind, that I believe that it's not only my mind, but it's also an influence of the unseen. Mm-hmm. This I would call deity, and this I would call the life that is in parallel with the physical life that I live. Mm-hmm. And so if you go back to our origins episode, if you want to take a look through YouTube and find out things that I've talked about concerning time travel, I'm talking about a timeline of eternality. And in that, I believe deity present in the eternal in all moments allows for that I don't have to fear what my next moment is. This is why I'm at ease. This is why I'm at peace.
Right.
This is why, and thank God at this point, anyway, I would say I don't deal with anxiety, in regards to that. And that's not to shame people with anxiety. It's to invite people with anxiety to consider these things. Right. And so in regards to that, I also feel a weight for humanity on my shoulders in regards to we just need to love each other. If we can't do anything, can't we love one another right now?
Right. Well, I think back what you were talking about with the kind of the invisible. I'm reminded of, and I've heard you say it. I've heard Rick Rubin, the master producer.
Oh, Rick.
Right. I mean, and there's a lot of people who would say that they are spiritual, not religious, whatever.
Yeah.
But especially, I've heard it in the context of making music. And there's something that happens within the and I've heard artists, and I've heard, as I said, Rick Rubin's got the podcast, Broken Record. And I've heard when they've talked about this element that's unseen that gets played out. And to me, and you identify that element that's unseen as, deity working whatever in that midst. And I think that whether or not you see it as deity, like there's something at work that we don't always see with our eyes.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important then for us to be able to say what's in the unseen that we can explore.
Yeah. Which actually, if you want to go to our Fringe episode and you want to chase down paths of things that you're like, are you guys really talking about this? I would say that would be a great episode to be able to listen into, because we do consider things, and all we're doing is we're just pushing out the box and saying, open yourself up to consider things that you would not even consider.
Right.
And so, so I think, like, in working down these lines, I have faced in this new season another opportunity to be able to ask, hey, what feeds my soul? And in asking that question, I would tell you, here's another thing that you may want to sit with and to consider. It's okay if you're at a place where you don't know what feeds your soul. But it is a wonderful pursuit to be able to go after that.
Yeah, because I think that would be fine too, and that's and that is the process of discovery.
Yeah,
and you asked the question to be talking about childhood discovery, but I think if we need to be people who are constantly trying to discover not just things about ourselves, but even things about other people.
And I think that that's probably why I like Star Trek. Because, really, they're going to places that haven't been discovered, and yet what do you get to see in each episode? It's the relational interaction taking place. Certainly, there's difficulty. How is that not different from humanity and life? Right. If you expect, and actually, that is another thing in the conversation last night with Amy that I had, is we were celebrating together the idea of having a partner where in the good and the bad, that we would be able to be there for each other. to be able to navigate the difficulties, even in the not knowing what the answers were at the end of just this part to work through.
Right.
But how cool is it? And so like I got to have the opportunity to just hold in my heart this idea of, man, we don't have the answers to this, but we're able to navigate it together. And so in that tension, in that struggle of not having an answer, that we're okay, and that there was a commitment to being okay in navigating that. Just such a great comfort. And I know that you and Heather share that together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's that's a place that I've worked towards, and to be able to even think about how it's okay not to be okay. I've tried to make that a constant kind of, because before I'd always, make sure that I was trying to present that I'm okay, even if I wasn't okay.
Right.
I needed to make sure that everyone thought I was okay, because that's what I wanted to present. And over the last couple of years, breaking that down and saying, you know what, like, there's a lot of people that are pretending. I don't want to be one of them.
And how freeing is that
Right.
for you in your life that you got to that place?
Right.
Yeah. And maybe there's a part where, even in the podcast of Cut Daisies and Unicorns, that as people are coming in, what makes them uncomfortable? I mean, literally, if they were to be able to get to minute 41 of this episode, that really, even to hear this, a lot of veneer people didn't even get this far.
Right.
But if you got this far and you're grappling with these ideas of what does it mean to move into a life where I'm okay with it not being okay?
Right.
And there, I think that's where, when I'm talking about why can't we love each other, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Is that real love isn't about what I get out of it. For me, real love is to be able to have the space that embodies that whatever isn't pretty, whatever isn't okay, that it's still okay.
Right.
And that there's room. And so
And
actually,
I think that there should be room in love, especially to be able to say, in love means I'm also going to understand that there are people that are going to be different from me, who are going to believe different from me, who are going to live differently from me, and to be able to say, in love, how can I still understand them?
yeah.
And still, process and go through life. I mean, how do we do that? And that's a whole process of learning what it means to live with love.
Yeah. What comes into my mind right now in regards to that, I'm going to bend and turn a corner.
We're going to go.
Well, it also means to be able to own the failure of what you don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember I was on a mission trip to Sweden, and as I was there, man, we got to do so many cool things. We busked. I mean, we were playing live music in the subway. We were playing live music out on the street corner. I mean, that was a blast. The food experience, fantastic. All of that. But it was during that time that I didn't have a lot of good internet connection. And so, like, my feed, I wasn't, on Facebook a lot. I wasn't getting emails and stuff like that. And when I landed on the ground in Minneapolis and pulled out my phone and was trying to catch up, all of a sudden there were pages and pages of #MeToo. And it may have been the first introduction to privileged white male that like started ripping me apart at the seams.
Yeah.
And so with that, you know, I just had to come to the realization that what was going on was this formation of voice of how women had been acted against and how the objectification of the female had occurred. And it was just it was a change, and it was a turn, and then that moved into Black Lives Matter. And you know, as we bring up these topics, then at minute 46 there are other people shutting off the podcast because they're not open to, you know, being able to consider a different perspective.
Yeah.
But March is the month that is known as, I have my notes out, International Women's History Month.
Right.
And so we wanted to just turn the corner and to take time to acknowledge, because probably one chip on our shoulder that we both carry is that we're two white guys doing a podcast. And for whatever that means, I mean, as much as we are privileged, it doesn't privilege us in the area of talking and speaking about things, because people come to it preconceived.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that we can learn over the course of our lives. And I know you have, I know I have. I mean, we learned a lot about, Black Lives Matter, and to be able to say what I don't know, I'm learning.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing when we get into, and I think that what I learned through that process of Me Too, and was not, and some people take it as, in a political way, and that's already, when you're already working with your bias, that if that's what you're turning off to is like, well, I got, they have their agenda and they're trying to be able, you're already off the end, sorry. But through the process of learning over the years, it's like, I didn't know that women, I mean, it's like 1 in 4 women have been, sexually abused.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that statistic.
25%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of all.
And if you bat over 300, you're taken into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Like that statistic of like, if that exalts an individual player to the point of being in a Hall of Fame, what does that say about humanity, that just shy of 30% of women have been sexually abused?
Right. I mean, and that to me is just even the sexual abuse. But
right.
What I also learned through the process then is even how our young girls, even before they become, women and, grow up into adulthood, maturity, whatever, is that they've learned about humanity, that humanity sees them only as sexual objects.
Yeah.
And it doesn't see them as people. So what happens to them? It means like, when my daughter now, who's, taking public transit.
Yeah.
Like at night, there's a whole different things that run through women's heads versus me when I'm out at night on public transit.
Yeah.
They're worried about, well, is there somebody following me? Is there somebody who's going to try to, do something? I mean, there's a whole set of things, like from my perspective, I never take into consideration ever, never before in my life.
Right.
And like, they have to process things in a completely different way. Even their surroundings
Yeah.
never even came across my mind ever.
Yeah.
Like, how is that? I mean, like, and that's your, over a lifetime, this is what you're taught as a girl. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And so in 2021, there is a sign, and I wasn't aware of it until I, did some research on it before our conversation here. And it's holding up the hand to accept the challenge. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll a YouTube video. And if you're listening to this podcast and you wonder about it, it is and you want to take a research, Anissa. If you Google Anissa International Women's Day 2021, choose to challenge. That's the YouTube video. If we get called out for having it in the podcast, we'll delete it out and we'll bring more. But I'm going to ask John to turn on camera 4's audio. And when I see that happen, I'm going to roll this footage and then we'll have some discussion. Yep, you're good. Yep.
Gender is a pre-written book. And the plot is boring. Daughter, girlfriend, mother, wife, rip out the pages, staple them to your back, and start soaring. Pretty, quiet, weak. They will try to describe you with such things, but you will use their stereotypes and turn them into your wings. When you choose to challenge, gender is a pre-written book. But not all the girls' stories end the same way. 33,000 girls are forced to become child brides every day. 132 million girls are not in school. And their futures are balloons that they watch drift away. But you are the full stop to the story. You are the new sentence that takes it on a different road. When you speak up, you open your palms and you share the load. When you choose to challenge, gender is a pre-written book, but not all of the characters are included, like the First Nations women who stand as still as statues, always walked past but never acknowledged or seen, or migrant women whose culture stands like a skyscraper, and they're forced to burn down the parts of themselves society doesn't deem convenient, or refugee women who are treated with brutality when we should have been lenient. And you are there as this story unfolds and you are faced with a choice. So choose to challenge. Gender is a pre-written book, and this is your chance to add your own chapter, to call out racism and sexism and use courage to rub it out, to stand where the rest of the world has chosen to sit, to call it out at home, at work, at school, bit by bit, to scream where the world has chosen to whisper, not just for your daughter, your mother, or your sister. Let us choose to challenge. Gender is a pre-written book, and if you're listening to this, then your actions are the pen. Your life is the paper. You are not the oppression of the past. I believe that you are so much greater, stronger, kinder. Choose to create history, not to be created by it. Choose to challenge.
All right, there we go.
Yeah, so spoken word can be so powerful.
Yeah. And the plan for this episode is to actually follow an interview with another woman of color and to hear her voice and
Yeah. To understand challenges, to understand a life from a different perspective.
yeah. You don't get to choose the life you're born into. But we can choose to love, to make space for people we don't understand, and to share the love that's been given to us.
Yeah.
It's kind of where I'm at.
And to me, I don't even know if I want to say any more because I think it's a perfect way for that to float and for people to understand that that's the direction. And that's the thing that we want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I just saw a movie called The Founders.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about the women who paved the way for the LPGA. And it was moving, and that it was so courageous. And I think my final question for the day is to ask the audience, what or where are you called to be courageous? So much of our life is benign that I float into, does it really matter? Is not even a hard turn. But what is in front of you where you need to take a stand? And I would say, I would even want to direct that, instead of standing against, what can you stand for?
So true. It's a great question to be able to ponder.
So we have multiple questions.
Oh, yeah.
And
More questions than answers.
and we just want to be able to put that out to you there, folks. Thank you so much for listening today. And we hope that as we continue to celebrate the women who have birthed us, the women that we've been a part of birthing, and the women who were birthed who love us,
Right.
just know that it's from a heart of love that we want to be strong with the women in our lives.
Yep. Well said.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a good-
Continue to reach out on the socials there. Let's hear from you. Hear your perspective. Hear your things that you're struggling with, the things that you're learning. And we would love to make that a part of the conversation. Take care, everybody.
Take care.